The early morning sky above the Pacific was a pale blue sheet, still cool and fragile, not yet broken by the heat of the coming day. Out over the open water, a formation of P-38 Lightnings cut through the air with long silver wings and the deep hum of twin engines that echoed across the horizon. The pilots inside were focused, calm, and alert. Every man knew today's mission carried danger, but also a new advantage, one the Japanese did not yet understand. Below them, further east, Japanese Zero squadrons were climbing from their island airfields, unaware that the tactics which had protected them for years were about to betray them. Japanese pilots were masters of turning fights. They lived and died by maneuverability. They relied on out-climbing and out-twisting their opponents. It had worked against wildcats, it had worked against early army fighters, and many believed it would always work. But they had never faced what was coming. The P-38 Lightning was a strange aircraft to many who saw it for the first time. 2 engines, 2 booms, and a central pod that housed the pilot, it looked more like a futuristic experiment than a fighter plane. Japanese pilots often underestimated it. They thought it was heavy, slow to turn, and vulnerable in tight dogfights. And in the early months of the war, they were right. But the American pilots flying these machines were learning fast. They studied every engagement, they memorized every mistake, and soon a new tactic emerged, one that allowed the P-38 to attack without ever giving the Zero the fight it wanted. It was called the high yo-yo. The tactic was simple in description, but deadly in application. Instead of diving straight into a Japanese formation and risking overshoot, the P-38 pilot would pull up sharply into a climbing arc, bleed off speed in a controlled way, and then swing down again with even more authority, landing a devastating attack from above while denying the Zero any opportunity to counter. The Japanese did not know this tactic yet. They did not understand its geometry. They did not anticipate how quickly it could turn an American disadvantage into a decisive strike. The first Zero squadron to experience it never saw the danger until it was too late. As the P-38 formation approached their expected interception point, the American flight leader scanned the ocean below. He knew Japanese scouts were watching. He knew the Zeros would be climbing soon, trying to meet the Americans head-on. He tightened his grip on the control column and spoke calmly through the radio. "Stand by, wait for them to commit, then go high." His wingmen acknowledged one by one. Minutes later, silver glints appeared far ahead, the Zeros, approaching in classic 3-plane V formations, beautifully aligned, disciplined, and confident. The lead Japanese pilots dipped their wings, signaling an aggressive climb to intercept. Their engines purred as they rose sharply toward the Americans. They believed they were engaging a standard duel of spade and maneuver. But the P-38s were not coming to duel. They were coming to reshape the fight. The Americans did not turn to meet the Zeros horizontally. They did not dive toward them. They did not allow the Zeros to gain angles. Instead, the P-38s climbed. A shallow climb at first, enough to draw the Zeros upward, enough to make the Japanese pilots believe they had baited the Americans into a vertical fight they could win. The Zeros' climb rate, after all, was legendary. Japanese pilots felt the familiar surge of confidence as they rose through the sky, closing the gap. But then the P-38s climbed steeper. The Zeros tried to match and did at first, but their confidence began to falter. Their engines strained, their airspeed bled away, their wings trembled. The formation began to spread, small gaps breaking open inside the one-stight V shapes. The American flight leader glanced over his shoulder. And now, the P-38s split upward, then arced over, then came down with crushing momentum. This was the high yo-yo in pure, perfect form. The climb gave them altitude. The altitude gave them potential energy. and the downward arc gave them speed, a kind of speed the Zeros could never match because their engines simply could not deliver the same power in a dive. The top P-38 rolled into the attack first. Japanese pilots stared in shock as the silver fighter dropped through the sky like a falling star. He lined up a Zero that had drifted only a few feet out of position, but in aerial combat, a few feet was enough. He fired a short burst. The nose guns spat a tight stream of fire that tore through the Zero's wing. The aircraft shuddered, rolled violently, and broke apart in midair. Its pilot never had time to react. The rest of the Japanese formation scattered, each man suddenly realizing they were under attack from above, from angles they hadn't expected, in a movement they didn't understand. The high yo-yo didn't allow chaos for long. It enforced control. The P-38 leader watched as the first kill fell away, then pulled into another climbing arc. His wingmen followed, each one executing the tactic like a practice dance. The Zeros tried to climb after them, but they couldn't. Their energy was gone, their momentum was gone, their cohesion was gone. They had fallen into the trap perfectly. As the P-38s pulled up again for the second yo-yo, the Japanese pilots began making desperate decisions. Some tried to dive away, others attempted evasive turns. A few stubbornly tried to climb again, unwilling to abandon the idea that they could outmaneuver the heavier American fighters. But none of it worked. The high yo-yo gave the P-38s choice. The Zeros had none. A second P-38 Dove picked a target cleanly and fired. The Zero exploded in a cloud of smoke and debris. Another Zero attempted a hard brake to the right, but the P-38 behind him matched the move, pulled high, then dropped down in front of him exactly as the Japanese pilot tried to turn again. He had nowhere to go. The American guns lit up, and the Zero disintegrated. All across the sky, the pattern repeated. Climb, arc, dive, kill, climb again. Japanese squadron leaders screamed orders into their radios, trying to regroup their scattered fighters, but it was already beyond control. The Zero was designed for tight turning fights, not energy-based vertical maneuvers. The pilots needed space, angles, and initiative, and the high yo-yo robbed them of all three. One Japanese pilot, a veteran of dozens of engagements, suddenly realized the truth. The Americans are not turning, they are falling from the sky. From his perspective, the P-38s looked like predators circling overhead, constantly disappearing upward and reappearing downward with lethal precision. Every time he thought he had escaped one attacker, another appeared from above. He tried climbing into the next American pass, a fatal mistake. His Zero stalled at the top of the climb, shuddered, and rolled into a helpless fall. Before he could recover, a P-38 slid past him, its guns blazing. The Zero burst into flames and fell in a long trail of smoke toward the ocean. Below, the remaining Japanese pilots realized they were no longer fighting a battle. They were fighting gravity itself, and losing. For years, they had relied on agility, but agility meant nothing when the enemy refused to fight at equal altitude. The high yo-yo turned agility into irrelevance. A Zero could not turn fight a P-38 that never stayed at the same altitude. A Zero could not escape a P-38 that dove at twice its speed. A Zero could not counter a tactic it had never trained to face. The P-38 pilots, meanwhile, felt something shift inside them. A confidence they had not felt before. A sense that they finally understood how to dismantle the Zero. As the dogfight stretched across the morning sky, the Americans tightened their formation again, ready for another sweep. The Japanese survivors attempted a final regroup, but their maneuvers were sluggish and desperate. The Americans struck again, and again, and again. Each high yo-yo created chaos in the Zero formations. Each dive left another aircraft burning. Each climb left the surviving Zeros powerless to chase. By the time the last Japanese fighters broke away and fled for home, their formation was shattered completely. The sky was scattered with smoke trails, drifting debris, and the faint glimmer of falling wreckage. The Americans did not pursue the retreating fighters. Their engines were hot, their ammunition was half spent, but more importantly, the P-38 leader knew the message had been delivered. The high yo-yo was no trick. It was not a temporary advantage. It was a new doctrine, one that Japanese squadrons had no answer for. As the lightnings formed up again and headed back toward their base, the pilots remained quiet, not from sadness, not from exhaustion, but from realization. They had just changed the air war. Below them, on the island still held by Japanese forces, pilots and ground crews watched the crippled Zeros limp home, many trailing smoke, some missing chunks of wing or fuselage, others landing hard on improvised strips. The men who stepped out of those cockpits were pale, shaken, and visibly defeated. One squadron commander confronted his pilots, demanding to know how American aircraft had managed to strike from above so repeatedly. The pilots tried to explain. Their voices trembled as they described the looping arcs, the impossible dives, the disappearance of the enemy into the sun, and their sudden reappearance moments later at impossible angles. They tried to describe the sensation. It felt like fighting ghosts in the sky. It felt like they were everywhere above us. It felt like we were climbing into deaths. But the most chilling description came from a quiet, experienced pilot who rarely spoke. "They were using a tactic we cannot counter," he said. "They climb away from our strengths and strike into our weakness. If they keep doing this, every Zero squadron will fall." His commander asked softly, "What do we call this maneuver?" The pilot shook his head. "I do not know its name." But the Americans did. And soon, everyone would know. Word spread quickly across Japanese airfields after that first disastrous encounter. The Zero pilots gathered around maps, diagrams, and chalkboards, replaying the fight from every angle. They tried to understand what had happened. They tried to explain the Americans' impossible control of altitude. They tried to rationalize how entire formations had been shattered in minutes. But no matter how they dissected it, the truth was the same. The Americans had found a way to dictate the fight without ever entering the Zero's turning envelope. Japanese instructors urged their men to stay calm, reminding them that the Zero's maneuverability was unmatched in close combat. They emphasized the importance of turning inside the enemy. They reminded them of their successes against earlier American fighters. But beneath their confident voices was tension, a growing fear that something fundamental had shifted. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, P-38 pilots were debriefing in a small, dimly lit tent. Charts hung from the walls, showing altitude curves and energy profiles. The squadron commander paced quietly as his pilots described every moment of the engagement. What they described was not luck. It was repeatable, reliable, predictable. The P-38 pilots had found the rhythm of the high yo-yo, and they liked it. Every man in the room knew instinctively that the tactic had not just worked, it had worked overwhelmingly. And the reason was simple: the Zero could not follow. In the quiet moments between briefings, some pilots admitted something unexpected. They felt almost pity for their opponents. The Japanese pilots they had faced were skilled, disciplined, precise, but skill meant nothing when the fight itself was stacked against them. The P-38 pilots had tapped into a higher dimension of combat. The dimension of energy, altitude, speed, conservation, recovery. They were fighting the war vertically, while the Japanese fought horizontally. The next engagement came 3 days later. A Japanese formation of 18 Zeros climbed aggressively into the sky, determined to restore confidence. Their commanders had drilled them repeatedly. Stay together, do not break formation too early, do not chase a climbing P-38, anticipate its dive angle. But no amount of drilling could recreate the chaos of real combat. The American formation approached calmly from the west, engines humming steady and strong. This time the P-38 pilots already knew exactly how the engagement would unfold. They had simulations in their minds. They had mental blueprints of the geometry. They had confidence. The moment the formations drew near, the Japanese pilots committed to the climb, their natural instinct, their advantage, their habit. And the P-38s used that instinct against them. The Americans pulled upward again, using the Zero's own climb as bait. The Japanese followed, at first eager, then confused, then alarmed as their airspeed bled away faster than they expected. The American leader watched them rising, climbing straight into the trap. "Yo-yo number 1, he radioed calmly. The P-38s pulled into their arcs. The Japanese pilots hesitated, a sign of fear creeping in. And that moment was all the Americans needed. The first P-38 dove. 1-0 rolled hard, trying to evade, but the Lightning's angle was perfect. Its guns fired, and the Japanese aircraft blossomed into a bright fireball. Another P-38 cut down through the formation, firing a burst that tore into a second Zero's cockpit. Both kills happened within seconds. Japanese formation discipline collapsed instantly. Pilots scattered, some climbed in desperation, some tried to break downward, others pulled into frantic turns, but nothing they did restored control. The high yo-yo had opened the fight in America's favor, and now the Lightnings pressed their advantage with ruthless precision. A P-38 latched onto a Zero attempting a steep climb. The Japanese pilot, knowing he couldn't outrun the Lightning vertically, tried to roll into a diving turn, but the P-38 paused, went high again, and swung down with even more speed. The Zero never completed its escape. The Lightning's guns stitched through its fuselage, snapping it in half. Another Zero attempted a head-on pass, hoping to use its superior nose authority in a direct confrontation. But the P-38 pilot knew this trick. He lifted into a high arc instead of committing to the head-on approach, then dropped behind the Zero as it passed underneath. The Japanese pilot realized too late that he had flown directly into the Lightning's crosshairs. He didn't even have time to transmit a warning before his aircraft ignited. Over and over, the Zero pilots confronted a terrible truth. The high yo-yo erased every advantage they once held. The Zero's turn rate did not matter. The Zero's agility did not matter. The Zero's lightweight construction did not matter. The P-38s never gave them the fight they wanted. Each American pilot applied the same principles. Engage only from above. Control the vertical. Attack with speed, not position. Never allow a Zero onto your tail. Never turn horizontally unless forced. And the Japanese pilots could feel the shift. The air war was no longer a duel. It was a hunt. As the battle intensified, the sky filled with spiraling debris and smoke trails. Zeros fell burning into the sea. Others spiraled downward in long, uncontrolled descents. One or two managed to limp away toward distant islands, Engines sputtering, wings damaged, pilots shaken. Below, Japanese radar operators watched helplessly as blips representing their pilots vanished from the screens. Senior officers gripped the edges of their desks. They had expected casualties, but not collapse. By the time the engagement ended, nearly half the Zero squadron was gone. American losses, 0. The most shocking part for the Japanese was not the number of aircraft lost, but how they were lost. Their pilots were not outmatched in courage, they were outmatched in physics. The Zero was made for knife-fight combat. The P-38 turned the entire sky into a diving board. When the American formation finally headed home, the radio chatter was subdued. Not because the men were shaken, but because they were thinking, analyzing, understanding. They had just proven beyond doubt that a single tactic, when mastered, could dismantle entire squadrons. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence officers interrogated the surviving pilots. Their testimonies carried a tone of disbelief and fear. They rise above us every time. They fall with impossible speed. We cannot get behind them. We cannot force them to turn. They climb into the sun and become invisible. We fire, but they are already gone. One veteran pilot drew the looping arc of the high yo-yo on a scrap of paper. His hand trembled as he sketched it. "This is the maneuver," he said quietly. "It looks simple, it is not. They use it to deny us everything." His commanding officer studied the diagram. He saw a curve rising sharply upward, looping over, then diving. He saw a pattern, but recognizing a pattern did not mean countering it. "Why can't you climb with them?" the officer asked. The pilot answered with brutal honesty. "Our aircraft dies in the climb," he said. "Theirs is born in it." The implications were impossible to ignore. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was being exposed. Its weaknesses were no longer theoretical. They were visible, exploitable, repeatable. Altitude management, the heart of aerial combat, belonged to the Americans now. Back in the P-38 squadron tent, pilots met with instructors, discussing how to refine the tactic even further. They adjusted angles, they compared notes on throttle control, they analyzed how to attack multi-plane formations with coordinated yo-yos. Some pilots suggested staggering the arcs to confuse Zeros even more. Others proposed maintaining tighter discipline to execute simultaneous dives. The tactic was evolving, growing sharper, more efficient, more deadly. The Japanese had no idea the Americans were improving it between every mission. Soon, news of successive defeats reached Japanese high command. Experienced pilots began disappearing at an alarming rate. Squadrons that once boasted unmatched kill ratios now returned home with aircraft missing, pilots wounded, and morale shaken. But Japan's leadership was slow to accept the truth. They blamed inexperience, they blamed poor visibility, they blamed bad luck, they blamed clouds, engines, equipment, even fate. Only a few officers recognized the true cause. The Americans were now fighting in a dimension the Zero could not enter. The next series of engagements would prove that beyond any doubt. When American reconnaissance reported a large Japanese force moving south to reinforce a frontline island, the P-38 scrambled. They flew low at first, staying beneath the cloud layer, engines roaring in a synchronized hum. As they neared the expected interception zone, the lightnings climbed together, slicing through the clouds into a bright expanse of blue sky. Below, the Zero formation appeared, a swarm of white silhouettes rising from distant specks on the ocean's surface. The formation was larger this time, better organized, more cautious. But caution meant nothing. The Americans climbed again. The Japanese followed, and the trap repeated. Only this time the P-38 pilots refined their timing. Instead of diving individually, they dove in staggered waves. The first wave broke open the Japanese formation. The second wave exploited the fragmentation. The third wave hunted down survivors. A Zero pilot tried a desperate counter. He rolled inverted and attempted a negative G pushover, trying to slip beneath the diving P-38. But the Lightning pilot simply pulled up into another yo-yo, waited for the Zero to lose momentum, and then struck from above again. The Japanese pilot radioed one final message. There is no escape. His transmission dissolved into static. Another pilot tried to lure a P-38 into turning. The American refused to engage horizontally. Instead, he climbed away sharply, forcing the Japanese pilot to commit to a vertical chase he couldn't sustain. The Zero stalled. The P-38 rolled and dove, and the Zero was gone. One by one, the same story unfolded across the sky. The high yo-yo was turning air superiority into inevitability. On the ground, Japanese ground crews watched smoke trails descending from distant battles, each one marking another loss. The airfields grew quieter, the pilots returning were fewer, the mood became heavy, suffocating. The Zero was still iconic, still legendary, still feared by many American units, but legends didn't matter now. The P-38 pilots had found the combination that unlocked the aircraft's power and shattered the Zeros. And the Japanese squadrons knew it. Some pilots began taking off with dread in their hearts. They no longer charged into combat with confidence. They braced for the moment the Americans disappeared upward, and the moment they came down again, guns blazing. One pilot confessed privately, "The sky feels tilted against us." Another said, "We no longer fight the Americans, we fight the angles they choose." And the angles the P-38 chose were always the same. High, unseen, inevitable. The battle for vertical control had been decided. The Japanese didn't lose it. They had never possessed it in the first place. But now, for the first time, they understood the cost. As the weeks went on, the P-38's high yo-yo was no longer just a tactic American pilots used. It became the defining shape of combat in the Pacific skies. Every engagement followed the same pattern. The Lightnings climbed with deliberate control, the Zeros followed with rising desperation, and then the Americans used gravity itself as a weapon. At first, Japanese squadron leaders tried small adjustments. They instructed their pilots to refuse the climb. They urged them to hold altitude and force the Americans into horizontal fights. For a moment, this gave them hope. If the P-38s could be pulled low, perhaps the Zeros could regain maneuvering advantage. Perhaps the Americans could be forced into a turning battle they could not win. But the Americans had already anticipated that shift. When the Zeros held altitude, the P-38s simply stayed above them, circling patiently, waiting for the perfect moment. They didn't descend into traps. They didn't trade altitude for unnecessary risks. They kept their energy advantage intact, their formation disciplined, their intent clear. Eventually, the Japanese pilots grew uncomfortable sitting still beneath an enemy that refused to make a mistake. Their nerves frayed, their formations developed small gaps. One pilot drifted upward to reconnoiter, another attempted a probing turn, another misjudged distance, and the moment any deviation occurred, the P-38s dropped in formation, executing synchronized high yo-yos that shattered the Japanese balance instantly. A group of Zeros attempted a coordinated counterattack by diving suddenly, hoping to force the P-38s to commit to their altitude. But the Americans simply climbed further, letting the Zeros fall uselessly into empty sky. Then when the Zeros tried to regain altitude, the P-38s rolled and used the high yo-yo again, diving directly into their upward recovery arc. the moment when the Zero was heaviest, slowest, and easiest to kill. Each maneuver, each kill, each strike reinforced the same truth. The Americans were controlling not only the altitude but the timing of every moment of combat. The Zeros could not initiate, they could only react, and each reaction placed them deeper into disadvantage. In the following engagements, the psychological impact became as devastating as the physical losses. Japanese pilots took off knowing exactly what awaited them: the rapid climb, the disappearing enemy, the sudden attack from above. They felt the dread settle into their chests long before the first shot was fired. Some flyers began trembling in the cockpit as they rose to altitude. Others avoided eye contact during mission briefings. The Zero, once a symbol of Japanese power, now felt like a fragile shell in a world of descending steel. The Americans, meanwhile, moved like a well-oiled machine. They developed hand signals for yo-yo coordination. They learned how to stack multiple arcs on top of each other so that one pilot could initiate an attack and another could slide into position for a second strike before the Japanese even recovered. Some P-38s would deliberately perform shallow yo-yos to force the Zeros into premature reactions, while others executed deep yo-yos to finish the isolated targets. Soon, entire Japanese squadrons found themselves not in fights, but in layered ambushes taking place in the sky, built entirely out of geometry and altitude. During one such engagement, a Japanese force of over 20 Zeros attempted a defensive wheel formation. They hoped to create a rotating shield, each pilot covering the tail of another, preventing the P-38s from getting clean diving angles. It was a tactic that had worked effectively against earlier American aircraft. But the high yo-yo dismantled it instantly. The P-38 leader ordered his men not to attack the rotating wheel directly. Instead, he instructed them to climb above it, wait for the wheel to drift slightly apart, and then strike the exposed aircraft at the top of the rotation. The moment the Americans dove, the wheel collapsed. Zeros tried to break formation and climb into the attack, but climbing into a diving P-38 was suicide. The Americans rolled over them like a hammer striking a line of eggs. One P-38 clipped a Zero across the fuselage with a burst so short and precise that the Japanese pilot barely had time to register the hit. Another lightning sliced through two rotating Zeros in a single pass, its guns firing such concentrated energy that both aircraft burst into fireballs that lit the Pacific sky like twin meteors. The wheel formation disintegrated, its choreography destroyed, and without choreography there was no defense. After that, Japanese commanders forbid the use of the wheel against P-38s entirely. Other tactics fared no better. Altitude traps, diving tricks, sudden brake turns, nothing worked against a tactic that lived in the vertical dimension. Even when Japanese pilots tried feigning weakness, drawing the Americans into overconfidence, the P-38 pilots refused to fall for it. They maintained formation discipline with remarkable consistency. As one Japanese pilot recalled, they never came alone. Even when one dove, three more were above him. The truth was harsh. The P-38s were never fighting individually. The high yo-yo allowed them to fight as a unit, with one pilot pulling the enemy out of position and another sliding into the perfect kill angle. This teamwork was something the Zero squadrons could not replicate. They had been trained for individual dogfighting brilliance, not collective energy traps. Many of their best aces were lone hunters, deadly in close combat, but nearly helpless when the battlefield itself favored the enemy. As more Zeros fell from the sky, the Japanese began facing a new crisis: the loss of their veteran pilots. These men had fought since the early days of the war. They had trained entire classes of replacements. They had shaped the culture of aerial combat in Japanese doctrine. When these veterans began falling to the P-38 yo-yos, entire squadrons felt the blow. Confidence evaporated. The new pilots lacked experience, lacked intuition, lacked the feel of the aircraft. They entered combat fearful not of enemy pilots, but of the unexplained geometry unfolding around them. One young pilot described the experience in his diary shortly before his final mission. "We climb and they vanish, we dive and they vanish. They are always above us like birds of steel. We fight the ghosts of altitude." The last major engagement of this phase of the air war came over a chain of islands the American forces planned to secure for future operations. Japanese command sent everything they had, dozens of Zeros, some still bearing the scars of previous battles. Their goal was to break American morale, to prove the Zero could still dominate the sky. But the Americans were ready. They climbed into the sun. They waited for the Zeros to rise. They watched as the Japanese pilots, exhausted but determined, pulled their noses skyward. And then the P-38s began. The first wave of high yo-yos shattered the front ranks. Explosions blossomed across the formation like red flowers. The second wave tore through the scattered survivors, striking from angles too steep for the Zeros to counter. The third wave cleaned up the remnants, pushing any surviving Zero either into a desperate dive or a smoke-filled spiral. Some Zero pilots tried fighting to the end. They engaged in hopeless turns, looping in slow arcs that offered nothing but vulnerability to the next diving lightning. Others attempted suicidal charges, rolling into head-on passes that the P-38 simply dodged with small yo-yo flicks. And some fled. They were not cowards, they were simply men who understood the battle was lost before it began. One Japanese squadron leader radioed to his men, "Break away, save your aircraft, this is not a battle, it is a slaughter." He turned his own aircraft toward base, its wings riddled with holes, its engine shaking violently. Behind him, the remaining Zeros retreated through a sky filled with smoke trails and burning debris. They carried with them the realization that they were witnessing the end of an era. The era of Zero dominance was over. The P-38 pilots returned to base in tight formation. Their engines roared evenly as they descended, their shadows stretching across the runway. Ground crews rushed to greet them, amazed at how few aircraft bore damage compared to the scale of the engagement. Debriefings were short now, there was little left to discuss. The tactic worked, the kills spoke for themselves. The high yo-yo had become second nature, a move so deeply ingrained in their instincts that pilots executed it without conscious thought. American commanders began referencing the battles in broader strategic discussions. They pointed out that air superiority no longer relied on sheer numbers or aircraft design alone. It now relied on who controlled energy, who controlled altitude, who controlled the pace. The Japanese did not control any of those things. In Tokyo, military analysts combed through reports trying to formulate a counter. They proposed faster climbs, steeper dive angles, coordinated traps, but the Zero simply wasn't built for the fight it was now facing. Its lightweight frame, once its greatest asset, became a glaring vulnerability in the vertical domain. The Americans were rewriting aerial warfare in real time, and the Japanese could not turn back the clock. In the months that followed, Japanese Zero squadrons grew quieter. They flew fewer sorties, they risked fewer engagements. Pilots often stared at the sky with unease, fearing not the silhouette of a P-38 but the shadow of one, the shape that came before the dive, the curve that signaled the yo-yo was coming. In the end, the tactic did far more than win dogfights. It dismantled morale, broke squadron cohesion, decimated veteran ranks, and reshaped the strategic balance of the Pacific theater. One American pilot wrote years later, "The high yo-yo didn't defeat the Zero, it exposed it." A Japanese veteran from the same campaign said it differently. "We thought turning was the heart of combat. They showed us that the sky has many hearts, and we were fighting in the wrong part of it." When the final zero fell in the last engagement of the campaign, spiraling downward in flames, the moment felt symbolic, not just of a battle ending, but of a doctrine collapsing. The Americans had entered the war unsure how to face the zero. They finished it with a maneuver that made the zero obsolete. And across the Pacific, from pilots to generals to historians, one truth echoed long after the fighting ended. Japanese Zero squadrons didn't simply lose to the P-38. They collapsed when the high yo-yo rewrote the sky.